Each of these horrific events took a huge toll on human life, so imagine my shock when I discovered the unhinged methods that people use to survive them. Between two nuclear warheads, being eaten alive, and the full weight of a skyscraper, you wouldn't think that with tragic events like these, the average person would be able to survive. And if you're anything like me, when first hearing this, it almost puts you into a state of disbelief on how this could even happen. So I decided to bring together 8 of the most unhinged disasters and how humans managed to cheat death and pull through alive. Each of these people fought through hell in their own unique ways. And although I can't actually show any of the things that happened to them exactly, as there's YouTube guidelines against that, I will be trying my best to explain in depth what happened to each person and how they managed to survive. And if that's not for you, feel free to click off this video. With that being said, I'm Mr.Mirage, and welcome to Unhinged Ways That Humans Cheated Death. Now, our first story starts at about 14,000 feet off the ground. Skydiving seems to be one of the most risky and thrill-seeking things that you can do, and something that you would never catch me doing even if you paid me. However, there are a lot of people that do it as a once-in-a-lifetime experience or something as a test of bravery, and Joan Murray was one of those people. Joan Murray was not new to this sort of thing. She was considered a professional, which made it that much more shocking when tragedy hit her. On the day of September 25th, 1999, she decided to do a solo skydive as she had done many times before. But as she plummeted at 120 miles per hour, something did not go to plan. Traditionally, when skydiving, you free fall initially and pull the parachute around 2,000 to 5,000 feet. A mini parachute then pulls the main one out of the bag. However, in Joan's case, it became extremely tangled and didn't manage to slow her down at all. Panicked, she pulled the backup chute, but out of the same nature, this one also didn't fully work. There weren't many seconds left, and although she was falling slightly slower now, being around 80 miles per hour, she was set to die on impact. Unable to do anything else, she sadly hit the ground, breaking almost every major bone in her body and severely damaging her internal organs. So at this point, you're probably asking the same question that I am. How is she still alive? And the answer is almost to the point of unbelievable. Although bones being intact are crucial, what matters most, in case you aren't aware, is whether the heart, followed by the lungs, can get oxygen and blood to the brain. And by all intents and purposes, Joan's heart should have stopped, killing her in minutes. However, as luck may have it, she fell onto a fire ant hill, which caused her to get bit thousands of times. And although this sounds like insult to injury, for those unaware, the significance of fire ants is their bites actually activate the body's response with the production of adrenaline, putting the body into a sort of emergency mode of sorts. This made her heart keep beating long enough for the ambulance to reach her, where they kept her alive with their required devices. It took nearly 20 surgeries, but eventually, after 2 weeks of being in a coma, she woke up and was alive. Now, I've also heard stories of the past of people jumping out of planes without parachutes and landing on big piles of things like hay bales or other soft items. However, in my case, if I was ever doing this, which, like I said, would not skydive, but if I did, then I would probably look for something like a lake or a pond or body of water that initially would feel like concrete, but I actually figured out in my backrooms video that there is a way that you can actually turn this around by throwing something before you to break the surface tension of the water, making it safe for you to land in and not break every bone in your body. But it goes without saying, please don't do this at home. If you're gonna go skydiving, please do it safely and make sure your parachute is inspected along with your backup chute, and don't ever jump out of a plane without a parachute. Now, the next story we're going to be going over is beyond what you would call an unhinged method to survive, as in order to save himself, a mountain climber would physically have to cut his friend's rope from him, dooming his friend to fall. However, as selfish and cruel as this sounds, there's actually a lot more to it than that. Let me explain. The month was June 1985. Two experienced climbers, Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, were going to attempt to get to the top of the at that point unclimbed Sierra Grande, a dangerous nearly 21,000 feet mountain in the Peruvian Andes. What could possibly go wrong? Well, they actually managed to make it all the way to the top. However, on the climb back down, they wouldn't be as lucky. Joe Simpson slipped and broke his right leg. And I don't know if you guys are aware, but breaking your leg mid-mountain climb might as well be as bad as falling off a cliff. A bit of foreshadowing there. Essentially, since Joe now could not walk down himself, he had to be lowered 300 feet at a time via rope. As you could probably guess, while being lowered, his friend Yates would slip off the cliff and both of them would now be dangling over the side, causing Joe to now be out of sight from Simon, and well, you know what happened next. And while this seems like an ultimately abominable move from Yates, you kind of have to see it from his perspective, as in the moment, he could nor see nor hear his friend, and he would dangle there for over an hour trying to figure out a way to save himself, and after a while, he would just assume that his friend had already died, and since he was already dead, he figured he has to save himself and cut his friend down, causing him to fall into the crevice below. However, the problem here was that Joe was in fact still alive. He rather, in a miraculous event, despite the fall, managed to survive with just further bruising and damage to his leg. He was then forced to crawl out of the crack, which, in case you don't realize how difficult this would be, an average human can crawl 0.71 meters a second, and that's on normal terrain and without the serious injuries that he had. So we can assume the real number is way slower. When going all the way down the mountain, he assumably needed to use some serious mental strategies. So along with following the terrain around him and using the little tools that he had left, he miraculously made it down the mountain. Although I can't really talk because I wasn't there and I'll probably never be in a situation like this, if I was, I would probably make the decision to cut us both down or find a way to navigate both me and the friend or loved one who was with me down the cliff, either using like an ice pick on the wall or some sort of other careful method. And I know there's a huge chance that they would just fail, ending in both of us falling, sustaining major injuries, but I feel like it'd be better for us to be still together and both injured than me basically damning my friend or loved one to death. And I by no means am saying that Yates was in the wrong by making the decision he did. It does make sense. However, I would not want to be the one to look my friend in the eye after he survived and damn well know that I doomed him. And it's like, I don't know how I'd do that. But regardless, let me know what you guys think he should have done. Once again, this tragedy happened to someone who knew what they were doing and was considered a professional in their field. However, this would not stop a massive river beast from swallowing them whole. Paul Templar was leading a group of people down the river like any other day. For those unfamiliar, rivers in Zimbabwe and really a lot of Africa can contain many dangerous creatures, including crocodiles, elephants, and in this case, a hippopotamus. For those unaware, these are one of the most dangerous animals in Africa. They are responsible for an estimated 500 to 3,000 human deaths per year, making them more dangerous than lions, elephants, and even crocodiles. They can weigh up to 4 tons and possess a bite force of up to 1,800 psi, making them able to easily crush things like watermelons and specifically bones, as if they are made of twigs. Not to mention, these huge things can book it insanely fast on both land and water. Now, I know I've mentioned how dangerous crocs are in my other videos, but for reference, hippos could snap them in half. So with this in mind, it is almost unfathomable that Templar was able to survive being literally eaten by one. Now, it doesn't take a genius to know the fact that hippos are herbivores, but that didn't stop this one from swallowing Paul head first. The story states that Templar was passing a known aggressive male hippo when it suddenly would capsize his friend's canoe, causing him to immediately run to his aid. The hippo would then launch itself out of the water and grab him off of his boat. Now, to Paul, being inside of a hippo's mouth felt to him like being inside of a wet, dark cave. He almost felt like he was underwater, but he knew that was not the case. And on top of this assumably claustrophobic experience, he also would have to deal with his legs and torso and lungs being punctured by the hippo's massive biting force. Lucky for Paul, the hippo would manage to eventually let him go, but this didn't stop him from having to amputate his arm in order to recover. And it seems the only way he was actually able to survive was with the teamwork of everyone else on his boat, pulling him from the river as quickly as possible and then immediately getting him medical help ASAP. It was also theorized that the hippo was able to let him go because he was so experienced with doing like river guides like this and with animals that he managed to keep calm surprisingly during this entire event that went down, and that caused the hippo to assumably not see him as a threat anymore, and probably was the reason it let him go. And hear me out with this, because as I said before, hippos do not eat meat, so eating a human would not be something out of them just being hungry, it would be something purely out of them being defensive. And if they don't see you as a threat, it will then just let you go and move on with its life. So I guess it's good to know that if you ever come in contact with a hippo, it might be smart to play dead if you're inside of its mouth, but still you shouldn't expect to survive. Now, up to this point, we have seen a lot of stories that changed in the blink of an eye. Freak accidents that happened too quickly to even process. But the horrific part of our next story is the fact that it happened so slowly, but yet there was almost nothing that the victim could do about it. Australian citizen Ricky McGee was traveling through the Australian Outback when he would suddenly find himself stranded for what would come to be 71 days. The Outback, for those unaware, frequents over 95 degrees Fahrenheit and is almost entirely dry desert-like terrain that, in my opinion, feels like you're almost walking on Mars. Towns are scarce and often hundreds of miles apart. McGee claims it was due to a car breakdown, but he also later suspected that he might have been purposely drugged and left for dead. Regardless, he was stuck in one of the harshest environments on planet Earth and truly a horrific nightmare. Apart from the immense heat and isolation, the Outback is also home to one of the world's most dangerous venomous snake species, along with some of the most venomous spiders, not to mention kangaroos and dingoes. So how did he survive? Well, first he would have to find a watering hole and use the location to his advantage, making a makeshift shelter. But starvation would become a major issue, and since options are limited, he would have to eat a diet of purely frogs, leeches, lizards, and grasshoppers, with the occasional rat or two that passed by. This sounds like complete hell, but lucky for him, after almost 3 months, he was found by some ranch workers and brought to safety. In his book, he later wrote that it took a lot of mental resilience and different strategies in order to live to see another day.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT.
When talking about atomic bomb, sometimes the term itself can even send shivers down your spine, and I couldn't even talk about the amount of times I was kept up at night by the thought of these things actually being used one day. However, there was a time in our history when they actually were used. For those unfamiliar, in the Pacific theater of World War II, the Japanese were fighting a long war against the United States, and while the US was winning, they were winning incredibly slowly and with heavy resistance and loss of life on both sides. So to end the war, the US decided to send 2 nuclear bombs to the Japanese cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which tragically would kill an immense amount of Japanese citizens. And this really solidifies that no one really wins in a war, because no matter what, innocent people are dying. But there is a story of one man who would actually survive not one, but both of the atomic bombs that would go off in Japan. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was on a work trip to Hiroshima when the first bomb would go off. knocking him off his feet and giving him major burns on the upper half of his body. Despite this, he managed to find the strength to get up and find shelter, spending the night in Hiroshima and the next day returning to his hometown, which unfortunately would be Nagasaki, where 2 days later on August 9th, the second bomb would be dropped. While being inside of a building this time, he was again knocked off his feet by the shockwave, suffering more radiation exposure and more shock from the blast. So how did he manage to survive both of these bombs? Well, to answer this question, we need to go into how nukes work. The bombs dropped back then were way smaller than the ones we have today, and the instant death radius only equals to about a third of a mile, with the radiation radius being about 0.7 miles and the fire damage being little over a mile. Tsutomu was lucky enough to be far enough that he only had to deal with the heat damage and the blast damage, therefore leading to his survival. Nowadays, nukes cover a much bigger ground, but back then, they were just the first prototypes, yet it was still enough to kill tens of thousands per bomb, meaning Yamaguchi was still fortunate to have survived them both. To be honest, if I was in a situation like this, I wouldn't know what to think. Half of me would think that the universe is trying really hard to kill me, and the other half would think of it as some sort of divine intervention. Honestly, this must feel like that feeling when you almost get hit by a car and just barely survive, times like 1,000. But honestly, if I was in his shoes after the first atomic bomb, I would think about it a bit and figure that there's no way in hell they would nuke the same spot twice, so I would make sure that I would stay in the general vicinity of Hiroshima, and I would go tell my family in Nagasaki to immediately meet me in the countryside in order to avoid the full force of the literal sun that was being brought down on these cities. And to be honest, if I got hit by both bombs, then I would still be afraid for the rest of the war that I would go 3 for 3. Regardless, I have a lot of respect for him for being able to get through this time and for now being one of the only people in the world to say that he survived 2 nukes. Now, out of everything I have covered thus far, the story of Jose Alvarenga disturbs me on a visceral level, and only because the idea of waking up one day surrounded completely by ocean is a deep fear of mine, and this is actually something that Jose would have to experience in real life. Jose started his voyage as a routine fishing trip accompanied by Ezekiel Cordoba. Soon after, a severe storm would take their boat out into the open ocean, miles and miles off course. Despite surviving the storm, they were now without any navigation, and since their boat was not designed for survival, they were now stranded. In order to survive, they would have to eat birds, fish, and turtles, along with drinking rainwater. Unfortunately, this was not a quick ordeal. They would continue to drift further and further, and when days turned to months, Cordoba, unfortunately, would deteriorate mentally and tragically pass away, leaving Jose alone on the waves. Now, for those unaware, when you are isolated for as long as they were, many people believe it ends up being the physical aspects that take you down, when in reality, the true majority of humans can understandably not handle situations like this mentally. So if you expect to survive, you will need to be able to keep a stable mind. Otherwise, you will find yourself succumbing to a mental collapse much quicker, as was the fate of Cordoba. So what exactly did Alvarenga do? Well, he'd use something that I like to call the castaway method, coming from Tom Hanks's movie Castaway, where essentially you find a way to trick your mind that rather than you actually being alone, that you have someone with you. And in the case of Castaway, that was Tom Hanks's character drawing faces on like a volleyball and pretending like it was an actual person, even if it was completely inanimate. Alternatively, Alvarenga did this method by basically pretending that rather than being dead, his friend Cordoba was still alive, as well as talking to himself frequently in order to keep his morale high. And now I know this does just overall sound completely crazy and like you'd be losing your mind, but in reality, it might be necessary to keep you going every day if your brain feels like you aren't alone and you actually have people with you, if you can trick it well enough. So in the end, Alvarenga's boat eventually would wash ashore on the Marshall Islands, and he would be found and rescued after a total of 438 days at sea. And honestly, if I ever would find myself in a situation like Jose, I'd probably just go all out with the castaway method, finding multiple different animals or inanimate objects to talk with, as well as making small goals and plans to catch certain amounts of food per day with small rewards. Oh, and of course, bringing a compass out to the ocean wouldn't hurt either. Now, our next survival story is going to be one you may be familiar with, as there are multiple movies covering it. And out of all the stories that I've gone over so far, these people, in my opinion, use the darkest method in order to survive. For those unfamiliar with the 1972 Uruguayan rugby team, essentially they were flying to Chile for their next match. However, their plane would crash in the Peruvian Andes, putting them at an altitude of 12,000 feet, completely and utterly stranded. Now, the survivors of this plane had many issues even right off the bat, the first of which would be the many injuries sustained from the crash, and dealing with the many who died in it. The temperatures would drop to negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit during the night, making shelter an absolute necessity, along with intense layering of every article of clothing that they had. This was so devastating for many reasons, but the first hit to the morale of the survivors was the fact that generally rescue missions don't look for too long of a time, as after a while, it is way too easy for everyone to be claimed dead, or the rescue deemed impossible as the mountains are too vast. In this case, this happened after only 8 days, leaving the survivors to fend for themselves completely, without hope of rescue. Now, I've been trying to hold off on this specific part of the story for as long as I possibly can, as it is a little bit difficult to recall. As when something like this happens, it is just overall sad for everyone involved. But I'll try my best. Despite holding out hope for some form of rescue, it would become obvious that they were going to need to eat something if they were to survive. And with the amount of people that were left and the lack of any wildlife up there, they would unfortunately have to resort to eating the bodies of their deceased teammates. And to make things worse, avalanches would strike their survival camp on a frequent basis, and this led to the death of 8 more of them, forcing the hand of the ones who remained. 2 of the survivors, Nando Parado and Roberto Canesa, would attempt a risky path to push through the Andes in order to reach some form of help. After walking for about 10 days and 30 miles, a Chilean would discover them and help them, along with going back for the remaining survivors, and in the end, 16 people would survive this disaster. Now, in my opinion, situations like this, as horrible as it sounds, and like I said, I don't want to sound like I'm undermining anything, because I have never been in a situation like this, so I don't know how terrifying that would be, but if I was, I feel like I would just bite the bullet and immediately do what they did towards the end, because if you compare the two, likely you won't get rescued. If you're in the middle of a situation like this, there are some situations where you might get rescued, but after a few days, there's a good chance you won't. So what I would do personally is I would just try to hopefully have a compass with me, and if I did not, I would just see if I could track using either the sun or another distance or direction indicator, and just walk that straight in that direction and hope to God that with the energy and the initial food that I had before the food dwindled, that I'd be able to make it out of the mountains before I managed to starve to death. And if I didn't, well, I mean, I would have had a better chance doing that than staying there for the weeks and weeks and weeks as they starve to death, and I might not have to eat anybody else, because I don't know if I'd be able to do that, to be honest. And with enough luck, you should be able to find help eventually. Now, before I go over Buzelli's story, I would like to make a second disclaimer. This attack was an extremely dark and tragic event in American history, and although many did survive, many did not, and many families had to deal with the horrible experience of losing a loved one. I am telling Pasquale Buzelli's story not to undermine any of the horrific deaths that came from that day, but to show that although there was a lot of bad, some Americans, through level thinking and sacrifice, were able to live to see another day, and my heart goes out to anybody affected. And if you're still sensitive to the effects of this attack in any way, shape, or form, I strongly suggest that you either skip over this section or click off the video. It doesn't matter at all to me. I'd rather you guys be okay. For those unaware of what I'm talking about, I am referring to the World Trade Center, and I would say the full name, but I don't think that's allowed. So when coming down to the events of that day, most of the people who survived were obviously beneath where the planes hit, and then were able to go down the stairs and hopefully get down before the tower collapsed. But the people who were above where the plane hit became trapped, and those are most of the people that died. The North Tower in particular had about an hour and a half before it collapsed, and that's where our focus will be on today. Buzzelli was an engineer working on the 64th floor of the building, and often the ones who survived had to make quick efforts to make the call to escape and not wait for instructions. However, not to his advantage, Buzzelli would stay put in the building until the second plane hit, and therefore would not make it to the bottom before the tower collapsed. The North Tower contained over 100 floors and thousands of people, so making it down would take time. And it was time they unfortunately did not have, as when Buzzelli would reach the 22nd floor, the North Tower would collapse on top of him. He would fall 22 floors down, unconscious, but alive. So how was this possible? Even to Buzzelli's account, he doesn't see how it's possible that he survived, but he's obviously grateful that he did. Many seem to think that he was able to take advantage of himself being in the stairwell and had a sort of structural seal around him, and he sort of, as a word, surfed the wreckage down to the bottom, and he landed on a concrete slab, making it so even though he took minimal damage, such as like breaking his foot and obviously the psychological trauma, and was rescued thankfully 2 hours later. Me personally, I believe freak accidents are horrific and should be taken seriously, and I love being able to bring some of the stories of survival together in this video. Now, I know this sort of video might be new for people used to my channel, but I've been meaning to bring a new variety to what I post, including content that focuses on both the fictional horror that I've been covering along with the IRL horror, and I might be throwing in a little bit of true crime for those interested. Speaking of which, I've been thinking about doing a part 2 of this video, focusing more on crazy ways people survived, like really dangerous criminals. So if you guys would be interested in that, make sure to tell me down below. And if you like this video, make sure to consider subscribing. I really appreciate it.
Well, that was quite an adventure. I'm sad to see you go, but don't worry, this doesn't have to be the last time we see each other. I got another cool video, just for you. Hurry, the video's almost over.